Existence and essence. In this presentation I will compare the two philosophies of Martin Heidegger and Jean-Paul Sartre, existence of the former and the existence of the latter, by comparing the two texts Being and Time by Heidegger and La Nausea by Jean-Paul Sartre. Sartre is convinced there is no such thing as human nature or essence, and his philosophy relies on this denial. What then is this existence that his existentialism relies on? Is it the same as Martin Heidegger's existence? Sartre read Heidegger and Husserl in Berlin before returning to France to write his first novel, La Nausea. If we compare the vision of existence set out in this diary-based novel, we indeed see many parallels between the two philosophies. In his first diary entry in La Nausea, the protagonist Roquentin is encountering a problem with the present-at-hand world, the world he sees around him, in the form of the stones he is wanting to throw into the sea. Such a simple action fills him with dread, and he drops them before running away. He is aware that this fear is creating a barrier between himself and others. In this case, the kids at the beach who were doing the same and whom he wanted to join in with. He is certain, avec évidence, that these changes are external to him, however, and not within him, and that he is not going mad. It is an integral part of his existence, normality even. He is certainly concerned with the world, which in Heideggerian terms is an existential. Besorgtsein in German, and he becomes more acutely aware of this problem as the book goes on. He becomes more concerned, we might say. In the Café Mably, a few days later, he insists again that he is not ill, and that the physical properties of his beer glass belie a greater truth, which demands to be taken seriously. It is slanted with a handle, he says. It has a small crest and a spade on it, and on the label it says Spatenbräu. I know all that, but I know there is something else, almost nothing, but I can't explain what it is I can see. He appears to be feeling his way towards the world of Dasein, of existence, before moving away from the ontic, which merely exists towards the ontological and understanding of being itself. To what extent is Roquentin's search for being, which is subsequently played out in this book, a search for the being of Dasein, the Sein of Dasein, of existence, we might say, another word for Sein, or being? If we consider Heidegger's existentials, which comprises existence, many of them appear to apply to his thoughts and actions. As well as Sorge, German for concern, his quest arises ex negativo, from an undetermined angst, from the negative aspects of life, and as a result of discourse with himself and others, which is directed towards seeing the being of beings, the being of everyday objects, a concept which Heidegger calls Gerede, discourse. Certainly he has fallen for the world into which he has been thrown. Geworfenheit in German, another existential of Heidegger. He has been thrown into the world since he returned from Indochina, and the world into which he has been thrown, it preoccupies him entirely. He is attuned to it, and is conducting inquiries into it, and it is also a regional restricted Raum, a regional restricted space, in terms of certain specific locations, such as the library, the cafe, the bar, in which the scenes take place in this small and inconsequential town, which he calls Bouville, mud town, a town in which he finds himself, German Befindlichkeit. Eventually, Roquentin finds his own meaning, another Heideggerian existential, Sinn, in German, by understanding the sinewy roots of a chestnut tree in the town's park. This contrasts to the present-at-hand beardlass in its irregularity. He subsequently explains how, prior to that, he had used the verb to be without really knowing what it meant. He had said the sea is green, or that white dot there is a seagull, without understanding what is actually meant. The root of the chestnut tree was me, he now proclaims. We might presume that such knowledge reconciles him with the manual workers in the Café Mably, the planning manufacturing humanity who made the glass. They have their truth, the truth of mathematics and physics, their ontologies, so to speak, and I have mine. Yet little actually happens afterwards to convince us of this. He meets up with his English ex-girlfriend of a few years previous, Annie, in the hope that they can rekindle their relationship. However, after spending some time together, they realise they have little in common anymore, and she decides she would rather be with another man, even though she admits he means nothing to her. Roquentin quits writing his book, and it's difficult to avoid the impression that both love and history, in the truest sense of the word, are impossible in this life world. The only solace, he appears to suggest, might be found in art that expresses this truth. If we consult Heidegger's Being and Time, we can see where the ontologies of Sartre and Heidegger both overlap and also diverge in the section on Mitsein, with being. Initially, in section 26, the Mitdasein, the Mitsein of others, and everyday with being, Heidegger tells us that others, in an everyday sense, are not everybody other than myself, rather the others here are those from whom you do not differ. This reminds us maybe of Sartre's famous statement from Week-Low, his later play, in which he stated, L'enfer c'est les autres, hell is other people. In other words, those that appreciate the same art, philosophy or music as myself are not hell, whereas others are. In section 27 of Being in Time, we encounter a divergence between the two philosophers. Here Heidegger goes on to talk about the they-self, in German, das Mann, and its importance of this to everyday Dasein. The they-self here is clearly not people from whom you do not differ, but rather people with whom you have nothing in common. In concern about what you do with, for and against other people, there is always the worry about the difference from the others, even if this expresses itself in attempts to get rid of this difference. Distance to others creates problems with Mitsein, with being together. All this initially sounds very discomforting and negative, but on page 129 of Being in Time, Heidegger tells us how the they-self is also an existential, and it's part of a positive composition of Dasein, since it provides a break for the subject. A person does not lose their self in everyday dealings with others they have nothing in common with, but rather this experience is conducive to the individual's self, because the subject-object dichotomy is overcome. What's more, Heidegger tells us that everyday Dasein draws a pre-ontological interpretation of its being from the nearest mode of being, which is the they-self, or das Mann. This is the most important concept for the being of Dasein on a day-to-day basis, he goes on to explain, because in everyday life, the world of Dasein is often skipped over in favour of present-at-hand objects. The they-self, das Mann, redresses this somewhat, restoring Dasein. So in this way, Roquentin's problems in the cafe were due to his failure to see das Mann. Of course, we cannot blame him for maybe not being an extrovert or being short on conversation. Yet as Heidegger tells us at the end of section 27, authentic self-being is not based on an exceptional state of being that is separate from das Mann, but is an existential modification of das Man. It is not possible, therefore, to be separated from das Man, the they self. Even when he was not engaging in conversation and feeling alienated, Roquentin was sat on a chair in a bar, enjoying a beer, both of which had been made by the other, we might say, planning producing society, die Vorstellende Herstellende Menschheit. And when he was staring at the chestnut tree in the civic park, which had been tended by the park keeper, he was sat on a man-made bench. And really he was not much further in terms of progress than at the cafe. At best he had found a representation of his nausea, but this was not yet Dasein, which as Heidegger tells us in part 1 of Being in Time, is a unity. In other words, if one existential is lacking, Dasein is not present. So if Sartre's being was not the being of Dasein, what was it? In section 7, Heidegger tells us about Erscheinung, physical phenomena, which can become shine, mere deception. He uses the example of somebody who displays the symptoms of an illness, but then the illness never really materializes. And so it falls back into shine, deception. In the same way, what appears to be a phenomenon of the being, the sign of Dasein, or of a Seiender, may likewise turn out to be deception, shine, if the link to Dasein is not made. In Heideggerian terms, then, his evidence, which he thought he had at the beginning of nausea, was in fact imaginary. It was deception. Though he did actually have the possibility, die Möglichkeit, to make this a reality, but he didn't take this opportunity because he wasn't able to see, or didn't want to see, das Man, the they self. Thus seen, Sartre's later statement that existence always precedes essence becomes a nonsense, because his existence was not Heidegger's existence, and he had rejected the sign of Dasein. When he talked about essence, he was only referring to a partial understanding of essence in Heideggerian terms. Maybe he was referring to the scholastic concept of essentia rather than Heidegger's more dynamic version of Dasein or Wesen. Maybe this was even due to the Latinate roots of his language. In his introduction to Being in Time, Heidegger tells us how Luther understood the Catholics' reliance on the scholastics and Aristotle had corrupted the basis. Yet years later, by offering a retreat to subjectivity as an alternative, Sartre, who was surely writing more in the tradition of Luther than he is of the Catholic Church, but with a similar quest, never did more than get close to this basis, despite Roquentin's initial musings in the Café Mably. We might call to mind the statement by another scholastic here, Thomas Aquinas, who, in talking about Aristotle and De Ente et Essentia, said, Quia parvus error in principio magnus est in fine, because a small error at the outset is a great one by the end. In many ways, this small error made at the start of Sartre's novel La Nausea becomes a great one, which is found as a line throughout all his philosophical writings.